Do you know if your patient correctly dissociates the pelvis from the spine when they move? Because if you don't have an objective way to measure it, you might be starting lumbar rehabilitation without really knowing what their movement pattern is. In many patients with lower back pain, the exercise might look correct to the naked eye. They do a squat, a glute bridge, or a hip extension without anything seemingly strange happening. However, underneath that movement, there may be an altered neuromuscular pattern where the lumbar musculature is taking on work that should primarily be performed by the hip. And precisely to detect this, we can use mDurance's Lumbopelvic Dissociation Protocol, composed of 5 tests that allow us to analyze which muscle leads the movement, where compensations appear, and how control between the pelvis and spine is organized. The first exercise is the squat. We perform 8 repetitions and observe mainly the relationship between the gluteus maximus and the erector spinae during the descent and ascent. For example, we can detect if the erector spinae increases its activation too much when starting the descent, or if the gluteus participates little when the patient returns to the standing position. In a patient who says that squats put a lot of strain on their lower back, this data can be especially interesting because it allows us to check if the lumbar musculature is dominating the movement. The second test is the glute bridge, also with 8 repetitions. Here we seek to analyze hip extension in a more isolated way. We can check if the glute activates from the beginning of the movement, if it responds with a delay, or if the spinal erector kicks in too early and remains very active throughout the entire repetition. We can also observe if the patient needs to increase lumbar activity to keep the pelvis stable. The third test is the deadlift. In this case, we add a loaded hip hinge pattern, and we can study what happens during the descent and, above all, during the return to the starting position. If the spinal erector increases its activity significantly, while the glute participates little or begins to activate late, we can detect a strategy in which extension relies excessively on the lumbar musculature. The fourth test is the hip extension, performed in quadruped or prone position. This is probably one of the simplest tests to directly analyze the relationship between the glute and the lumbar musculature. When the patient moves their leg backward, we want to know who is really leading the movement. It may happen that visually the extension seems correct, but the EMG shows a high participation of the spinal erectors and a lower or delayed activation of the glute. And finally, we have the Sorensen test. Unlike the previous tests, here we are not looking to analyze repetitions, but rather the capacity of the lumbar extensor musculature to maintain a contraction over time. We can observe if premature fatigue appears and also compare the activity between the right and left erector to detect possible asymmetries. And what do we achieve by combining these 5 tests? A much more complete picture of the patient's lumbopelvic control. We are not only assessing whether they can do a squat or lift their leg. We are analyzing which muscles they use to achieve it and how that strategy changes depending on the task. And this is especially important before designing the exercise program because 2 patients with the same lower back pain may need completely different interventions. If we find that the spinal erector systematically dominates and the glute participates little, we can orient the treatment towards the re-education of that pattern and use EMG biofeedback to teach the patient to increase glute participation while avoiding compensations. Furthermore, if we repeat the protocol throughout the treatment, we can objectively verify if that pattern is changing because often the difference lies not simply in choosing one exercise or another, but in understanding what the patient is actually doing when they perform it. If you want to discover how to use surface electromyography to assess lumbopelvic control, detect compensations, and design rehabilitation programs based on objective data, request information about endurance, and discover how to incorporate these measurements into your clinical practice.